Drives are nothing more than bound excitations. At the level of each binding, an ego is formed in the id, a passive, partial, larval, contemplative, and contracting ego. The id is populated by local egos, which constitute the time peculiar to the id, the time of the living present, there where the binding integrations are carried out. The fact that these egos should be immediately narcissistic is readily explained if we consider narcissism to be not a contemplation of oneself, but the fulfillment of a self-image through the contemplation of something else. The I, or the seeing ego, is filled with an image of itself in contemplating the excitation that it binds. It produces itself or draws itself from what it contemplates and from what it contracts and invests by contemplation. This is why the satisfaction which flows from binding is necessarily a hallucinatory satisfaction of the ego itself, even though hallucination here in no way contradicts the effectivity of the binding. In all these senses, binding represents a pure passive synthesis, a habitus which confers on pleasure the value of being a principle of satisfaction in general. Habit underlies the organization of the id. The essentially lost character of virtual objects and the essentially disguised character of real objects are powerful motivations of narcissism. However, it is by interiorizing the difference between the two lines and by experiencing itself as perpetually displaced in the one, perpetually disguised in the other, that the libido returns or flows back into the ego, and the passive ego becomes entirely narcissistic. The narcissistic ego is inseparable not only from a constitutive wound, but from the disguises and displacements which are woven from one side to the other and constitute its modification. The ego is a mask for other masks, a disguise under other disguises. Indistinguishable from its own clowns, it walks with a limp on one green and one red leg. Nevertheless, the importance of the reorganization which takes place at this level, in opposition to the preceding stage of the second synthesis, cannot be overstated, for while the passive ego becomes narcissistic, the activity must be thought. This can occur only in the form of an affection, in the form of the very modification that the narcissistic ego passively experiences on its own account. Thereafter, the narcissistic ego is related to the form of an I, which operates upon it as an other. This active but fractured I is not only the basis of the superego, but the correlate of the passive and wounded narcissistic ego, thereby forming a complex whole that Paul Ricoeur aptly named an aborted cogito. Moreover, there is only the aborted cogito, only the larval subject. We saw above that the fracture of the I was no more than the pure and empty form of time separated from its content. The narcissistic ego indeed appears in time, but does not constitute a temporal content. The narcissistic libido, the reflux of the libido into the ego, abstracts from all content. The narcissistic ego is rather the phenomenon which corresponds to the empty form of time, without filling it, the spatial phenomenon of that form in general. It is this phenomenon of space which is presented in a different matter, in neurotic castration and psychotic fragmentation. The form of time in the I determines an order, a whole, and a series. The formal static order of before, during, and after marks the division of the narcissistic ego in time, or the conditions of its contemplation. The whole of time is gathered in the image of the formidable action. As this is simultaneously presented, forbidden, and predicted by the superego, the action equals X. The temporal series designates the confrontation of the divided narcissistic ego with the whole of time, or the image of the action. The narcissistic ego repeats once in the form of the before, or lack, in the form of the id. This action is too big for me. A second time in the form of an infinite becoming equal appropriate. to the ego ideal, a third time in the form of the after, which realizes the prediction of the superego. The id and the ego, the condition and the agent, will themselves be annihilated, for the practical law itself signifies nothing other than the empty form of time. When the narcissistic ego takes the place of the virtual and real objects, when it assumes the displacement of the former and the disguise of the latter, it does not replace one content of time with another. On the contrary, we enter into the third synthesis. It is as though time had abandoned all possible mimetic content, and in doing had so broken the circle into which it was led by Eros. It is as though it had unrolled, straightened itself, and assumed the ultimate shape of the labyrinth, the straight-line labyrinth which is, as Borges says, invisible, incessant, time empty and out of joint, with its rigorous formal and static order, its crushing unity and its irreversible series, is precisely the death instinct. The death instinct does not enter into a cycle with Eros, but testifies to a completely different synthesis. It is by no means the complement or antagonist of Eros, nor in any sense symmetrical with him. The correlation between Eros and Mnemosyne is replaced by that between a narcissistic ego without memory, a great amnesiac, and a death instinct desexualized and without love. The narcissistic ego has no more than a dead body, having lost the body at the same time as the objects. It is by means of the death instinct that it is reflected in the ego ideal and has a presentiment of its end in the superego, as though in two fragments of the fractured I. It is this relation between the narcissistic ego and the death instinct that Freud indicated so profoundly in saying that there is no reflux of the libido onto the ego without it becoming desexualized and forming a neutral, displaceable energy essentially capable of serving Thanatos. Why, however, did Freud thus propose a death instinct, existing prior to that desexualized energy, independent of it in principle? Undoubtedly, for two reasons, one relating to the persistence of a dualistic and conflictual model which inspired the entire theory of drives, the other to the material model which presided over the theory of repetition. That is why Freud insisted on the one hand on the difference in kind between Eros and Thanatos, according to which Thanatos should be addressed in its own terms, in opposition to Eros, and on the other hand on a difference in rhythm or amplitude, as though Thanatos had returned to the state of inanimate matter, thereby becoming identified with that power of bare or brute repetition that the vital differences arising from Eros are supposed only to cover or contradict, in any case determined as the qualitative and quantitative return of the living to inanimate matter. Death has only an extrinsic, scientific, and objective definition. We see no reason to propose a death instinct which would be distinguishable from Eros, either by a difference in kind between two forces or by a difference in rhythm or amplitude between two movements. In both cases, the difference would already be given and Thanatos would be independent as a result. It seems to us, on the contrary, that Thanatos is completely indistinguishable from the desexualization of Eros, with the resultant formation of that neutral and displaceable energy of which Freud speaks. This energy does not serve Thanatos, it constitutes him. There is no analytic difference between Eros and Thanatos, no already given difference such that the two would be combined or made to alternate within the same synthesis. It is not that the difference is any less, on the contrary. Being synthetic, it is greater precisely because Thanatos stands for a synthesis of time, quite unlike that of Eros, all the more exclusive because it is drawn from him, constructed upon his remains. It is all in the same movement, that there is a reflex of Eros on the ego, that the ego takes upon itself the disguises and displacements which characterize the objects in order to construct its own fatal attraction. that the libido loses all mimetic content and time loses its circular shape in order to assume a merciless and straight form, that the death instinct appears indistinguishable from that pure form, the desexualized energy of that narcissistic libido. The complementarity between the narcissistic libido and the death instinct defines the third synthesis as much as Eros and Mnemosyne defined the second. Moreover, when Freud says that perhaps the process of thought in general should be attached to that desexualized energy, which is the correlative of the libido become narcissistic, we should understand that contrary to the old dilemma, it is no longer a question of knowing whether thought is innate or acquired. It is neither innate nor acquired but genital, in other words, desexualized, and drawn from that reflux which opens up onto empty time.